Hi, I'm Andrew Feinstein, the writer of The Shadow World. I don't think I'll comment on the film.
Hi, I'm Jeff Shantz. I'm a faculty member in criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University and a co-founder of the Critical Criminology Working Group, where our focus is on issues of corporate crime and state crime and intersections of corporate and state harmful activities. And I'd just like to thank our guests for the work. Really important work, and it was a powerful piece. And I'd like to thank also KDocs and the KDocs crew for really your work in creating a venue where we're able to discuss issues of such importance and relevance. And I think it really is quite important that we discuss these issues in a Canadian context, where we still are very much governed by a myth of Canada, the peacekeeper, even as the Canadian state is working to become a major arms exporter. We've heard about the infamous Saudi Arabia deal, the deal with Philippines that we heard about a week ago. And despite the fact of our own imperial histories, the histories of Canadian imperialism, and despite the fact that the country itself is and was founded through military occupation, colonialism, and where the military occupying force is still very much active in our communities, the RCMP, at federal, provincial, and municipal levels. So I think it's important that we kind of shift the way that we talk about these things in Canada and the extent to which, the character of which we talk about these things in Canada.
I'm Johan, Grimonprez, the director of the film, in collaboration with Andrew Feinstein. There's much to say, but I can talk a little bit about our collaboration and how the book, actually, because it's based on a book with 10-year research by Andrew Feinstein, that made it into the film. And the book is not the film. We had to distill two templates. One was the fact that well, the book is a big encyclopedia with about 700 pages and 2,000, 3,000 footnotes. So it was a tough one to choose to make that into a film, because there's a lot of things to say about corruption, but it's hard to find the money for making that into a film. Such a contradiction. But two templates that we distilled out of the book was one that it's not sort of the shady characters that live in the shadows that are those weapons deals, but it's actually this runs into the highest corridors of power. It's the politicians actually that are the biggest dealers in this corruption. And the second is that while reading the book, the first thing I noticed, and it starts with Boris Zakharov, the first chapter, is that actually this is not about ethics, this is arms dealing. It's about actually making as much profit as possible. And so with the first weapon dealer that is sort of the focus on in the book is that he was dealing to both sides. And that was another template that we distilled out of the book. Besides that, I thought it was crucial for this film also to have an emotional anchor in this film. And hence that I thought that what that arms trade does to, for example, the Global South was very important to include in the film. And so hence that we have Marta Benavides, Vijay Prashad, people that could speak to the Global South and sort of deliver in a way, on an emotional level, what that does to the rest of the world. Because I think the arms trade is the big elephant in the room. When one talks about the problems in the world, even like when we talk about, you know, sustainability, ecology, the climate, et cetera, it's that all the money that should be used to actually fight the real enemy, I think, is all being slashed off by stealing our taxes to actually keep this whole profit of war going on. And so that's a crucial thing. We could talk about much more, but in a nutshell, that's sort of what, for me, what was crucial in this film.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Neve, and I'm the Secretary General of Amnesty International here in Canada. And I first want to, from my heart, my soul, which feels a little bit wrenched right now, want to really express thanks and appreciation and respect to both Andrew and Johan for the book and the film, which, as you've already highlighted, is so needed because of the complete paucity of transparency and information and reporting we've had about these kinds of issues for so long. And what a profound, harrowing story you've been able to bring together of so many threads that interweave in these very ugly and insidious ways. So many human rights threads. And I, with 1 minute, am really challenged to think which of those threads I in particular want to chase. But I guess I really do want to focus on the arms trade side of it. Which is so central to everything here, and the hypocrisy and cruelty and utter disregard for life that is the global arms trade. I do a lot of frontline human rights work with Amnesty missions throughout sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and there's moments of sorrow and frustration that arise so often as the accounts of terrible abuses in the midst of war zones come together. But I never feel so much anger as when we are doing the arms research, when we've visited the site of where some sort of air-to-ground missile's gone off, or any number of different weapons, and there's fragments which we're able to gather, and we take them back and we trace them. And of course, more often than not, they originate in an arms factory in one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. No surprise, because they account for 80% of the global arms trade. And the numbers, of course, are so staggering around the arms trade. $100 billion a year, the global arms trade. $100 billion. It's even sort of impossible to imagine that amount of money. And a statistic I saw recently in some of our reporting, over the last 15 years, the top 100 arms manufacturing companies in this world have done $15 trillion worth of business, which is about $1/3 billion every year. The numbers are absolutely staggering, but of course it's the impact, it's the consequences for women, for children, for civilians who are killed as a result of these horrific arms trades. The United States itself, over the last several years, has been willing to sell weapons to 170 countries in the world. That's only 23 countries that they won't do business with. Makes you wonder what it takes to not make that list. And sadly, we know those 23 countries are not necessarily the worst of the worst, because the worst of the worst are probably almost certainly amongst the 170. Into this, of course, comes the Arms Trade Treaty, which is an important contribution to, it's a small contribution. Some have said it was a bit of a naive effort and contribution, but nonetheless, 5 years ago, we finally have a binding international treaty that's meant to bring some rules to this horror. And Canada's not there yet. It's stunning to think that 5 years on, Canada hasn't joined the Arms Trade Treaty. Andrew highlighted in his opening remarks the fact that we do have legislation in front of us right now which is supposed to get us there, but deeply flawed. Amongst other things, it continues to exempt more than half of Canada's arms trade, which is with the United States, from scrutiny and arms control. That makes a bit of a mockery of the notion that we're actually joining the treaty if we're going to exempt half of the subject matter of that treaty from its coverage. And I just want to end by reminding us, as several have, that we as Canadians cannot be smug here. We have become an arms trading nation. Saudi Arabia is, of course, the perfect example. We know that years going forward now, we have the prospect of $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles heading over from a plant in London, Ontario to Saudi Arabia. And that's not the limit of our arms dealings with Saudi Arabia. Canada does at least $2 to $3 billion worth of arms business every year. It's impossible to come up with a final number because we don't know the value of what's going to the United States. I think that would be an eye-opener for most Canadians. They don't imagine that that's a big part of our economy, but it is, so we've got to confront this ourselves. Sorry, that was more than a minute.
I forgive you. And now we're going to open it up to questions and comments from the audience. Please raise your hand, and we'll have a runner come over and bring a microphone to you. We'll do our best to try and maintain a speaker's order.
So I'm an old woman, and what I notice is in this film that makes me want to cry, the role of women is to die and to try and stop someone from killing our children. The only proto-woman you hear from in the film is Margaret Thatcher, and I want to say she has never been a woman. She never was. I want to know what you men are going to do to stop each other from killing us.
Yes, love that question.
I see no other question. Look at the school killings in the States where, Americans think they all need to have massive amounts of munitions so that men can go around and kill one another. And then it just gets on a bigger and bigger and bigger scale where we have diplomats in limousines driving up to greet each other, and it's supposed to be a good thing. And even when I see some that I want to respect, I have to say they're just killers. They're killers meeting with each other, and they want to make money out of threatening me and my children. What the fuck is that? And what are we really supposed to do except go home and get drunk or worse? Yeah.
Shall I speak to that? It was a very important question when we started working on the film, like, what we can criticize and articulate what's wrong with the world, but what's the way out? That was absolutely crucial to think about as a sort of making also this film building up through juxtapositions. I think this film is about the privatization that's going on in our corporatocracy, because I do think that lobbyists are having such a stronghold on what's going on in political life, and we're all like being shut out basically. So there's 3 defense lobbyists for every politician in Washington. Am I accurate with the numbers? In UK. But I think it's also not only about the privatization of our tax money, it's also the privatization of our political imagination. And I think all that, it doesn't matter if it's man or woman, but I think what we lost is this participatory ally towards politics that we've lost. And I think, it's touched upon in the film, and it's about, when Eduardo Galeano says, we're all basically storytelling animals. We're made of stories, that actually it's time to rethink that story as well. I think it's absolutely crucial. And I know it's touched upon only lightly, and of course, the fact that we have to criticize and stop a halt there, but it's also like, on the other hand, it's so crucial to rethink that story, our political story. So when Michael Hart says, should we choose for industry of war, of fear, or actually try to reimagine what connects us, that political imagination, I think it's so crucial to rethink that as well. So I think we're all part of that. I don't think it's just man or woman or only man, or, it's rethinking that story, the sense of community.
Sorry, before we continue, just want to quickly introduce. We have Wade here. Thank you, Wade, for joining us. He's going to join our panel now.
What can we do? And we is all of us. I mean, as I said in my opening remarks before the film, I first came to this trade when I saw it effectively destroy one of the most hopeful young democracies on the planet, the South Africa of Nelson Mandela. And it took all of 4 years for the arms trade to completely undermine that hopefulness. I think the first thing we can do is all of us, because everything that happens, as I mentioned earlier, in this trade happens in secrecy. The first and most important thing we can do is disseminate information. Disseminate information that the powers that control this industry don't want in the public domain. And that's a huge part of what this film is about, what our work is about. And social media is a very powerful tool, sometimes misused, but all of our work is on Twitter, on Facebook. Feel free to have a look, just look for my name on any of those sort of social media things, and it all goes there. We have a new book out, a smaller book called Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade, that you can download for free on a site called projectindefensible.com, which is a very easy way to talk about the most obvious myths that are perpetrated about the trade in weapons. The second thing is, I think, for people to get involved. I mean, in Canada, you have a very good organization working on this. In Amnesty International, you have Plowshares Canada, but also get involved politically. Because the biggest problem in the global arms trade is there is absolutely zero political will to do anything about it. Unfortunately, Alex, the arms trade treaty has actually created more problems than it's solved. It has allowed politicians to say we've dealt with that. It has allowed some companies like Japan, some countries, sorry, like Japan and Switzerland, to actually weaken their arms export control regimes in order to conform to the weaker standards of the ATT. And the ATT is completely unenforceable because it's dependent on the governments. And the problem is that the politicians benefit so much, both economically and politically, from the trade in weapons that they're not interested in doing anything. And then I think we need to remember that as citizens, this is all being done in our names with our tax dollars. And there's a component of the Veterans for Peace in the United States of America who, for the last few years, when they calculate their taxes, they calculate their tax liability and they then exclude what they call the Lockheed tax, which was calculated by a wonderful researcher in the US called Bill Hartung, who calculated that 30 cents of every dollar paid in tax in the United States of America goes to the defense companies. So they simply take that 30% and they put it into a peace fund. And the revenue authorities in the US don't know what to do with them. And I think more of us in more countries should think along those lines.
I'll just add a couple of things, and I think part of the documentary and part of what we need to be thinking seriously about is sort of getting past the myths of democracy that we operate under as well, because the documentary showed very clearly that the sort of surface democracy isn't the democracy. It's not the decision-making center, right? So it's the advisors, it's people in the PMO's office, it's people that we have no opportunity or option to vote in or vote out of office. And they're making fundamental decisions that affect policy, that affect our lives, and they come from business, corporate lawyers, corporate accountants, and they come from arms manufacturers, right? And so we need to recognize that what is posed as democracy is not democracy, and we need to see where the real power lies there. And I think too, that's also recognizing that in one of the areas of our lives where we spend most of our time at work, there's no workplace democracy, right? So we have very little control over the way things are produced, what is sold, how it's distributed. So I think we need to confront those sort of, that false democracy that we operate under. I think another thing too is the sort of false morality that poses the authorities and power holders and whatever states and governments do as right and legitimate, but those who oppose as violent or criminal and what have you, right? The criminalization of dissent, aspects of repression in our society. And we need to shift that morality. We need to open up spaces for direct action to stop destructive activities in our society and to prevent states from criminalizing righteous action in defense of our society and in defense of positive social relationships. And we can think about that, in the Canadian context, the extreme police repression against protesters when we have events like the G8 meetings and the G20 meetings, which are precisely bringing together global elites to meet behind closed doors, protected by the police, protected by the state, where they can hatch out and lay the frameworks for deals and agreements and policies on a whole range of issues that are going to negatively affect us and negatively change the structure of our society. And I think even in our communities, we can think about the militarization that operates within our communities increasingly. I live in Surrey, for example, and in Surrey, we're subjected to, on a regular basis, helicopter flyovers by police shining spotlights into our backyards, into our houses, patrols by armored personnel carriers. This is in Surrey, right? Armored personnel carriers. I think they have a Bearcat that runs up and down King George Boulevard from time to time. And some of the research that I've been doing with students at KPU, we've uncovered that they're actually doing drone exercises. The police are doing drone exercises in Surrey as well, right? That's the militarization. That's the militarization of our society, and we can confront that, and we can contest that. C. Wright Mills in The Power Elite talks about the military metaphysic, this coming together of politicians, corporate leaders, and arms manufacturers. And he talks about this military metaphysic. We come to see our world through a military lens, right? So we talk about things, idiocies like a war on poverty. We're waging war on poverty, right? A war on drugs. A war on crime, right? We adopt that framework, and I think those are some things we need to do that at a very basic interpersonal and community level.
I want to pick up on the first part of your very passionate intervention, which was really highlighting the degree to which the arms trade is brutally and insidiously and obviously gendered in every aspect and dimension possible. And I'm going to go to the Arms Trade Treaty one more time, totally agreeing that there's all sorts of challenges and weaknesses, and I think whether it will take us far down the road we need to go is a huge challenge. But the story about gender in the Arms Trade Treaty is a particularly cautionary one. Anyone who did follow the negotiations around the Arms Trade Treaty will know it was an incredible uphill battle by a number of civil society groups and more importantly, incredibly strong women's rights activists and survivors of gun violence from around the world who fought a incredibly challenging effort to get references to gender-based violence into the Arms Trade Treaty. It didn't make it into the main section which establishes the absolute clear prohibition on no arms shall be sold if it'll lead to war crimes, genocide, or crimes against humanity. It didn't make it into the secondary tier, referencing serious international humanitarian law violations and threats to peace and security, etc. But it did make it into a third tier where at least, and sometimes your victories seem so minimal, but they are still so important. At least it's in the treaty. Recognition that concerns about gender-based violence have to be taken into account. But it's just this taken into account language. Well, let's bring that back to Canada. I and others have highlighted the fact that we're in the middle of a legislative debate around what we're going to do to get on board with the Arms Trade Treaty. There's all sorts of problems with the legislation. About a week ago, we did hear from Minister Freeland that the government is now prepared to actually strengthen the weak legislation that they brought forward. And much to our surprise, one of the things they've agreed to do is to bring that language about gender-based violence, which is so weak in the treaty, and in Canadian law, put it right at the heart of the provision that will establish the prohibition, the absolute prohibition on arms deals from Canada. Now, of course, as we always know, the devil's in the detail. We've not seen any wording. We don't know how real or effective that will be. But I'd offer that to us as maybe one little hopeful piece that we should latch on to now over the coming weeks and months. of ensuring that that legislation is going to be strengthened and absolutely holding the government to account on that promise. We heard from Minister Freeland that this legislation will bring a strong absolute prohibition on arms deals that will lead to gender-based violence in other countries into Canadian law. That could be an important step forward.
I feel a bit at a loss because I'm joining late, but I wanted to jump in on something that my colleague Jeff Shantz talked about, which is the kind of facile, hollow version of democracy that's often paraded out in these cases. And I wanted to share a little personal reflection. When I was 17 years old, I joined an organization called People for Peace. And that organization was inspired by Helen Caldicott. You may remember her. She was one of the leading spokespeople during the time when the planet was clearly threatened by a nuclear holocaust. It still is clearly threatened by the possibility of a nuclear holocaust, by the way. But at that time, it was something novel, and she was able to, I think, get a lot of people mobilized. And I remember high school students at my school getting involved. And I remember us feeling it was our sacred duty and a calling, partially because Helen Caldicott was saying at the time, it's your planet that you're going to inherit. Now, I think today about the spectacle we saw around the G20 protests in Toronto, and I think about the messaging that young people receive about what it means to protest today. If you protest today, you will be met by the iron fist immediately, right? And with no holds barred. You think about the kettling that happened, the young people who had their dorms invaded by the RCMP and the Toronto police and were held for days on end there. While the police were trying to figure out how they wanted to proceed, those kinds of things. And I think, it's really clear that the messaging around what kinds of democratic participation are acceptable and what kinds are absolutely unacceptable and will be crushed. It's really clear that young people today get the message that their participation in democracy is not wanted in some ways. And I have to say, I see this all the time with my students, because by the time they get to university, they've already been enculturated into this idea that they should be passive, right? Passive, almost consumers of democracy, rather than architects of democracy. And I have to say, I think it's brutally saddening to see that. And one of my first, I think, missions, and I know that many of the people at Kwantlen share this mission, is to try to rouse them from that dogmatic slumber and say, actually, no, that's wrong. That's a phony, that's a counterfeit notion of what democracy is, right? That's democracy only at the polling station, right? And democracy is actually a lived experience that should be much more expansive than that includes dissenting, refusing to consent. Anyway.
Johan, I've seen a lot of your work, your early work as an experimental filmmaker, and this I've seen twice. I'm sort of going to go off on a tangent, but not really, because I'd like to talk about the form of your this documentary. There's a very famous, now dead sociologist called Raymond Williams, and he said, it's very easy to make despair convincing and much, much harder to make hope possible. And there's something really interesting in this film, and it's a thread that runs through it that has to do with the grammar we use to tell stories and Galliano's own work. For me, the really strongest elements of your film is when it is sort of most abstract and most felt, because in a sense, we know we're in crisis. The least powerful parts of this film are when I'm bombarded with a lot of information that I do need to know. But I think there's a space that we have to open to talk about what can documentarians, documentary filmmakers do now with the form to really, create an energy that is hopeful, beautiful, singular. And you had it from time to time in this piece, but I also think it then kind of veered off into a political information platform, which is necessary information. But I just want to talk to you a bit about your use of found footage, for example, which is beautiful, and the possibilities of documentary film now.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it form. I would sort of allude to the fact that it's more trying to open up what that storytelling is. It's our terms, you know. Why are we more talking about something of being against, but also, you know, what is choosing for? I think it's so crucial to reconsider that. You know, when we had Mahmoud Darwish in the film, and we had Kadel Maner, a friend of Mahmoud, Palestinian poet, recounting him, but then we cut it out because we chose Edward Galeano. But what Mahmoud said is that he was writing poems about love to actually dismantle the fact that he's not able to write about love. And I think that's so crucial. I think it's absolutely crucial. And I know it's just hinting at, because the film is bookended by these big gestures of empathy, that in a sense, when people were at the front in 1917, 1916, millions of people were embracing each other. They didn't want to fight each other. But it was the big shots that shot above their heads and pushed them back into war. But the film is bookended, starts with that, and it ends with that. And there's a reason for that, because in a sense, our nature is not to be aggressive, but it's trying to live together. And that's been forgotten because, you know, all the social Darwinist myths that have been justified to legitimize all the deregulation in the 80s with Thatcher and Reaganism, and we are greedy, so-called, you know, we're all selfish individuals, is such a powerful myth that is still so out there amongst politicians that actually it's so untrue. I think we need that new story of what actually connects us. And I think, you know, when Michael Hart really talks about, you know, should we choose for fear or should we choose for love? I think it's an absolute important question. And love is sort of like this big word, but in a sense, it's the two poles in this film is the privatization of everything, you know, of our money, our taxes, but also our story, our imagination. And the other pole is like, what is that community? What is our political participation? I agree when you say, you know, we're not consumers. We're not consumers. We're not even consumers of fear or greed. We should be participants in what it is to be in a community. And I think that's so crucial. And yes, with this film, I think with Dial History, maybe you know Dial History, which is the chronology of hijacking, but then set against this story of a dialogue between a terrorist and a novelist, and the novelist says, you know, well, my role as sort of the one who plays on this level of community and consciousness being taken over by the terrorist because he's able to play the media much better. Anyway, the terrorist, I think, is a generic term, because I think also war is just, you know, as Howard Zinn says, terrorism with a bigger budget. I think terrorism is a very generic term because it's sort of, you know, it's a racist term even because, you know, we're all being labeled actually terrorists. We're all being criminalized now because we're until we're not proven sort of not guilty, but we're all like have domesticated this fear when we step into, we board, when we say goodbye to people, when we take an airplane, you know, you have to take off your shoes. We're all drilled into being sort of this fear-driven sort of, you know, adopting of this stance of being criminals. And I think it's why should it be, you know? I think inherently we're storytellers who'd like to tell a story and share things, you know, share community, but as being hijacked. I think, you know, the democratic process is indeed being hijacked. I'm drifting off, but I don't know if you know, I could talk much more. Dial History and Double Take, previous films were, the point of departure were novel story, it was novelists, you know, it was with fiction writers. But here, I took on the challenge to work with Andrew Feinstein, and this is investigative journalism. So that made that, you know, we had to stay true to the aesthetic, to the aesthetic codes of journalism. You know, there's certain stories that were in there that we had to cut out. You know, the chemical attacks that seem harsh in, I think it was London Book of Reviews when it came out, was pointing that actually a truck had actually crossed the zone from Turkey with the knowledge of Turkish intelligence and the American intelligence that actually delivered it to the rebels, and that Assad was not involved. We had to cut it out because we couldn't vet it. We asked Robert Fisk about it, but he said, yeah, 99% is Assad capable, but in all likelihood, 99% this story of Simmer Houj is true. But we had to vet it, and so we couldn't vet it. We couldn't have 3 backup sources, so we had to cut it out. So there was this this constraints of the fact that actually this film had to deal with a journalistic endeavor, but still it was absolutely crucial to that emotional anchor that I was talking about, to you know, have Montazar al-Zaidi, the fact that he was throwing a shoe, and that he says, you know, no, we were not like throwing flowers at the invasion. You know, I felt it so important to throw a shoe at Bush, because to hear somebody from the global south was able to speak out. I thought that other story was so crucial. But also that other story of Chris Hedges that has gone through, you know, the worst of humanity is capable of, then still coming back, suffering from trauma, being in the war zone for 20 years, even speaking out against what the New York Times was pushing him to do, speaking out against the invasion of Iraq, losing his job. But after 20 years, you know, suffering from trauma, that he goes back to love, to say we have to connect. That is what is going to heal us. And I think it's so crucial that, you know, underneath all the activism and saying what's wrong with the world, it's absolutely important to say, you know, how do we connect? And that's absolutely as important a story. So Rebecca Solnit, you know, hope in the dark. She says hope will come from the shadows. So I hope, literally, it's a quote from the film. So I hope, yeah, indeed, that other story, the subtext is underneath there as well, with Mahmoud Darwish, you know. Maybe somebody else wants to add something.
We have time for 2 more questions and 10 minutes for discussion. So 2 more questions.
Yes, you spoke about the importance of secrecy in this business. And the question is, if we're going to discuss Canadian contribution to weaponry, we need to put a face to that. Does anybody actually know who's manufacturing components, weapons, for the weapons industry in Canada?
There's thousands of companies. It's huge. I mean, there are some well-known, like General Dynamics, which of course is at the heart of the deal with the Saudi light armored vehicles. There's Bell Helicopter out of Montreal, which was the company at the heart of the deal to sell helicopters in the Philippines, which has now been scrapped, fortunately. There's the Streit Group, which is a very shadowy and kind of insidious Ontario-based industry, which also has offshore presence in countries like the United Arab Emirates, which it now turns out is how they get around UN arms sanctions, etc. You know, we're selling through the UAE, so it doesn't come under Canadian arms control. But the Streit Group is selling arms to the Sudanese government that have shown up in Darfur. They've sold weaponry that's ended up in the middle of Libya, all sorts of things. So it's a long list, and we need to continue to make sure there's coverage and publicity around that. I don't know that there's a comprehensive list. I think Andrew referred earlier to the work of Project Plowshares. They're probably one of the best sources that has really tried to compile a lot of that factual information. But we don't have all of that information anywhere, and we should. And it just comes back to the theme that's been, I think, emphasized by everyone about how there's such little transparency around all of this.
Plowshares.ca, which is their website, is certainly the best place to get the available information. And then there's something called the SIPRI Yearbook, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. They produce this annual, it's like the Bible of arms exports and imports statistics. But as Alex and others have said, probably about half of Canadian exports and imports aren't recorded, because they were the United States of America. And the United States of America produces between 30 and 45% of all weaponry in the world and buys 30 to 45% of all weaponry in the world every year. So what Canada is doing is basically complicit in that, and is effectively the United States' poodle when it comes to the weapons trade, along with Israel on the other side, who do a huge amount of the research and development for the US defense sector. But never lose sight of the fact that the biggest arms dealers aren't any of those companies. aren't any of the probably 24 Canadian citizens who act as intermediaries in the arms trade, as the dealers or brokers or agents, and I write about a few of them. But it's also worth remembering that through Canadian financial institutions, an enormous amount of arms deal and other illicit finances are laundered. Not as much as in the City of London, which is the money laundering capital of the world, but a significant amount. But the most important thing to bear in mind is that the biggest arms dealer in this country is your Prime Minister. That is the case and will always be the case. So if you have a problem about the nature of Canada's involvement in the arms industry, start with Mr. Trudeau, who the only difference between him and Tony Blair is that it took Tony Blair a few months to renege on all his campaign promises around the arms trade and an ethical foreign policy. It took Justin Trudeau a few days.
I'll maybe just add quickly, too, that we don't have to look all that far from some of our own sort of public infrastructure in Vancouver either, right? So we could look at SNC Lavalin, which was a long time involved in munitions, has been involved in infrastructure. There's been some scandals around SNC and infrastructure in Libya and corruption there. SNC Lavalin, of course, built Canada Line, SkyTrain, right? Bombardier, I believe, has had involvement in components, and Bombardier, you can also ride on the SkyTrain because they build the actual vehicles that are riding on the SkyTrain, right? There was a company, an aerospace company, I think it was based in Richmond, that had a controversy a couple of years ago too around guidance systems. So I would suggest taking a look, online and seeing if you can track down some of the information on that. And just to add to the Plowshares, there used to be an Ottawa-based group. I think they were called the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade. I think COAT was the acronym. They published a newsletter on a regular basis, a very low-tech newsletter, like Xeroxed and stapled. But they put the PDFs of the thing online, and I believe their website still exists, so you can look them up as well. And they did extensive research on the whole gamut of corporate government involvement in the arms trade in Canada, specifically Canadian context.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to bring back the word capitalism. We kind of propagandized into believing that corruption is something that happens in the global south and that our pristine Western democracies find corruption totally foreign. But the point is that all of these people who have been corrupted are being corrupted by big Western corporations in cahoots, as we've learned, with our governments. I'd like to suggest, though, that the corruption of the ANC actually began before this arms deal. It began with the claim that they were giving up the Freedom Charter to prevent a bloodbath. And the Freedom Charter would have required the nationalization of South African mining, for example, to pay for the things that the majority people of South Africa had been denied for 400 years, if you want to go back that far. And the bloodshed that has resulted since apartheid ended in South Africa because of like AIDS and the fact that this money wasn't spent on educating people so that they could do jobs, etc., etc. I don't think that you can fully discuss this situation if you don't bring in how integral it is to capitalism and how you're not going to solve this, no matter how active you get people to be, unless you address the problem that is capitalism.
As a South African, I have to say that is the worst Canadian accent I've ever heard. But regardless of the accent, the short history lesson on South Africa is very accurate. The ANC, the arms deal that effectively scuppered South Africa's democracy, was simply a continuation of an arms deal that was going to take place under apartheid. And all the same people were involved. And if the ANC had dealt with apartheid-era corruption, a lot of those people wouldn't have been around to enable this arms deal to happen. And that was part of the bargain that was done. The other part of the bargain was quite correctly that we bought into not just a notion of capitalism, but a notion of neoliberal capitalism. And I think one of the reasons that myself and the producers, a company in New York called Louverture Films, which ironically is owned by Danny Glover, who made his name in the Lethal Weapons films, but is actually an extraordinary political activist. Danny and his business partner, Jocelyn Barnes, sent me off to see about 18 directors. And one of the main reasons we went with Johan was not only because when I went to meet Johan in Brussels for the first time, he had a copy of the book that looked as though he dragged it through a forest. It had sort of things sticking out of it and notes all over it. And he was the only director I spoke to who immediately said, you know, what we have to do is we've got to get to the systemic source of this. And it's why the film starts with it actually starts with the First World War and the Christmas truce, but why Thatcher and Reagan are so crucial in the early part of the film, while Milton Friedman features in the film. Because this notion of neoliberal capitalism, the deregulation and privatization of everything, then runs like a thread, because if it wasn't for that, the trade would not be able to do what it does with the impunity with which it does it today. And of course, I personally find it extremely difficult that both Thatcher and Reagan described Nelson Mandela as a terrorist, which comes back to the point that Johan was making earlier. And in fact, in the case of Margaret Thatcher, demanded that the apartheid state execute him. And this was as recently as the 1980s, because she thought it was extremely dangerous having him alive in jail. But the ANC bought in to this notion of Tina that Thatcher developed, that there is no alternative economically. And living in the United Kingdom now, where you're seeing this edifice of what they call public-private partnerships, the notion of outsourcing the public sector is just falling apart before our eyes. I mean, a company that runs about a third of the British state went into liquidation a few weeks ago. And in the last 18 months, as the company was heading off the precipice, the directors paid themselves over £230 million in bonuses. And excuse my language, but absolutely fuck all has happened to them. But millions and millions of Britons don't get the services that they've been paying for. And South Africa bought into that same corrupted bargain. And that is why today South Africa has a formal unemployment rate of nearly 30%. But our macroeconomics were stabilized after 1994 at the cost of millions of people being without work, being without social grants. And it's why I go back to the remark I made in my introductory remarks before the film. You know, the importance is not just on the enormous damage that this trade does in the world. The hundreds of thousands of people who are killed every year using these weapons, in the absurdity that was mentioned by the first member of the audience who raised a question of, you know, we've just seen a whole lot of kids slaughtered in the United States again and that orange fool goes to the hospital and gets photographed giving the thumbs up, he received $30 million during his campaign from the NRA. And that in microcosm is the problem of the global arms trade. But again, the global arms trade is a lens on our politics and economics and just how profoundly fucked up they are.
So we've watched the documentary, we've listened to the panelists. Since we're in the middle of Black History Month, I thought I'd pull in a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "The hottest place in hell is reserved for those who stay silent in times of great moral conflict." So we watched this, we listened, we spoke. What are we going to do next? Well, for those of you in the crowd who are looking to, apply some direct action to this, you can head over to www.canadianpeaceinitiative.ca. They're a lobbyist group looking to demilitarize our government and do a bunch of other things if you're interested in getting involved with them. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists, Director Johan, Alex, Jeff, and Wade.